Welcome to the class video for Module 6, in which we'll look at John Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, a classic of imperial protest during the American Revolutionary period. We're making an important turn in the syllabus. We've looked at two broad theoretical models, one associated with the British tradition in John Locke, and one associated with the continental democratic tradition in Rousseau. For the remainder of the course now, we're going to be looking at American writers, though we want to think about them here at the start as British North American colonial writers. And we're going to be interested to see the construction of a uniquely American civic discourse out of these traditions that we've been talking about, both the Rousseauian versus the Lockean version of the right of democratic revolution, and also that older classical tradition associated with Aristotle. The nature of the readings are also going to change in that whereas Locke and Rousseau were trying to describe kind of generic philosophical models using generic categories, most of the remaining readings for the course are responding to specific historical events. And so we're going to need to get a little more locked into the timeline and spend a little more attention to detail in the events around the writers that they're responding to. So we have in the next two readings here with Dickinson, and then in Module 7 with Tom Paine's Common Sense, two versions of the colonists' argument for revolution, their denunciation of Parliament and King as tyrants, and their declaration of their natural rights to form their own structures of government. So we're going to spend a little time here in Module 6 setting up the historical setting for the revolution, the nature of the colonial grievances. And we'll see that Dickinson is very different than Paine. He's both writing earlier in the timeline toward revolution, and he is himself more moderate. He's one of the few, I think, 3 delegates to the Continental Congress who refused to sign the Declaration of Independence when the vote was taken. So we're going to see both a more moderate form of protest in Dickinson. Paine is much more radical. He is much more enthusiastic for revolution. He's also writing 8 years later, after a whole sequence of events have radicalized the patriot movement. But Dickinson is also a very different kind of writer. He's really thinking like a lawyer and dissecting the different parliamentary statutes that he thinks constitute the constitutional structure of the empire. And it's on the basis of that he's declaring Parliament has exceeded its authority, has engaged in tyranny, and justifies colonial resistance. Paine, we'll see, is much more of a rhetorician, a kind of poet of revolution, and he's going to employ these Lockean and Rousseauian terms in much more dramatic fashion. Your assignments for Module 6, then, are to read Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, to take the Dickinson reading quiz, and now that you have articulated a concept in your concept essay, you know what the focus of your final paper is going to be. You should be looking for passages that discuss a similar concept here in the Dickinson reading to what you're working on for your textual genealogy. Let's turn now and try to set up the historical context for revolution. When the British North American colonists argue in the 1760s and 1770s that the king is a tyrant or that the king and Parliament are acting tyrannically, we know from having read Locke that they don't mean that word tyranny in just the generic sense of they're bad rulers or we don't like the decisions that they're making. They mean something technical, that is, that they are exercising power beyond right, that they are changing, if you remember from Locke, the forms and rules of government. Locke meant by tyranny something roughly like what we Americans mean by unconstitutional, that the fundamental rules of government have been violated. Of course, the 18th century Britons don't quite have that language yet to describe a politician's exercise of power as being unconstitutional. That is going to be the product of American civic discourse. So we need to understand what were the forms and rules of government for the British Empire in the 18th century. Or in other words, what was the constitutional structure of the empire. Now we have to keep in mind, if you recall from our discussion of Locke's historical context in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that the British Constitution is nowhere written down as a single document. The British Constitution is based on tradition, and they would recognize certain fundamental judicial decisions, certain fundamental decrees issued by kings over 1,200 years, and certain statutes of Parliament as being of a higher law, of a more fundamental type of law than other types of judicial decisions, acts of the kings, or statutes passed by Parliament. But precisely which documents are included and which excluded from the British Constitution is a matter of political debate. It's a very different way of thinking about a constitution. In 18th century British colonists trying to understand what were the relations of sovereignty, what is the relative power between the British center and the colonies that they lived in, would really have two ways of thinking about that question. The laws that govern the trade relationships between the colonies and the imperial center, which are the primary focus of John Dickinson's piece, Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, and what we're going to look at in more detail here in Module 6. And the second way of thinking about the constitutional order of the empire would be to think about the colonial charters, that is, the official decrees of the kings that brought the colonies of Massachusetts and Virginia and Connecticut, etc., that brought those colonies into existence, that gave them a kind of corporate body and right to rule. We'll look at the colonial charters when we get to Module 8, and we're thinking about the state constitutions that get written during the Revolution. Both the colonial charters and the laws governing trade, what would be called the Navigation Acts or the Acts of Trade, have their origins in the middle of the 17th century. And so we need to go back to the period of the English Civil War to understand the logic of the system that the British end up creating by the time of the American Revolution. If you recall, the first half of the 17th century, or the 1600s, in Britain, there was an escalating constitutional crisis between king and parliament that ultimately culminated in a civil war, Parliament putting on trial and executing King Charles I, and then trying to rule for 10 years without a king, what's called the Commonwealth period, which ultimately imploded on itself, and Parliament ends up asking Charles's son, who becomes Charles II, to come back and take the throne again in 1660, what's known as the restoration of the Stuart line. One of the primary issues that led to the Civil War was the power of taxation. And in brief, not to get into too much detail, the essential question was, could the king impose taxes without Parliament's approval? Parliament's position was that taxes were gifts from the people to the king, and Parliament, as the representatives of the people, were the only authority that could approve that grant. We'll see this language mirrored in Dickinson's letters in just a moment. So we arrive at a kind of awkward moment in 1660 when Parliament has sort of won that debate in the 1640s, that is to say, they captured the king and executed and demonstrated their power over the king, and yet their own experiment in government has failed, and they end up recruiting another king, indeed the same line of kings, to come back and resume authority. So there's a delicate moment here in 1660, the moment of the Restoration, and the new king, Charles II, is acutely sensitive to the problem of taxation. That is, he does not want to end up with the same fate as his father, right? But Parliament at the same time is in a comparatively weak position to assert its constitutional authority and the right to overthrow a king. They just tried that and failed. Out of this awkward situation, there's going to emerge in the 1660s and 1670s, really in that 30 years or so preceding the Glorious Revolution, a new understanding of the king's authority and sources of revenue, which primarily focuses on the colonies and the king's sole authority over the colonies. The logic roughly goes, and again we'll come back to this in Module 8, that Parliament had nothing to do with signing the official documents, that is, the charters that created the colonies. Therefore, the colonies are outside of Parliament's jurisdiction. Parliament is the legislature for the islands of Great Britain. The colonies have their own legislatures who have an independent relationship with the king. Out of this kind of legal theory, Charles II is going to implement two policies that are important for understanding the colonist arguments in the 1760s and 1770s. The first thing he's going to do is create a whole bunch of new colonies. He's going to take the map of North America and the Caribbean and other British possessions around the world. He's going to subdivide the existing colonies, especially Massachusetts and Virginia, create a bunch of new little colonies in what had formerly been the territory of those colonies. And then he's going to hand those colonies to his friends, the noblemen, the rich guys of Britain who had stayed loyal to the Stuarts while they were in exile during the Civil War and the Commonwealth period. Charles II rewards those loyal followers by basically creating colonies for them, and we'll come back to that strategy in Chapter 8. The basic idea is Charles gives this land to his friends. Every immigrant that they bring over and who takes up a land claim has to pay Charles a small fee in order to have their the title to their land considered legal and valid. It's called the quit rent. So you have to pay this quit rent tax for the king to put his stamp on your land title to officially own your land. So there's going to be this small tax revenue that comes from the colonies through these proprietary colonies that will be a source of revenue for Charles II, for which he does not have to go and ask Parliament's permission or approval. Again, we'll come back to those new charters in the in the 1660s and the 1670s, primarily in Module 8. The other thing that Charles II did was create a series of laws, and Parliament assented to these laws, known as the Navigation Acts or the Acts of Trade, which create a set of rules for how people living in different British colonies around the world, the laws governing with whom they may trade and on what terms. So there is, and again, the tax revenue from this system is going to be the king's revenue that he does not have to go seek every time Parliament's permission for. Now, Charles has to create a system that is cheap to run, and that's essential to understanding the logic of this British Atlantic system. He does not want to have to go build a big navy to enforce all of these rules, and he doesn't want to have to hire enormous cadres of sort of administrators and officials and cops to inspect boats. He doesn't want a very expensive system to manage, because both of those things, either having to build a big military, a big navy, or having to create a big administrative structure, inevitably he will have to go to Parliament to get permission and to get appointments and the various things that he needs to do to implement such a system. So the Charles's kind of genius insight into structuring the empire, which ultimately 2 centuries later is going to become the model for virtually every other European country, is to understand, to try to create a kind of perpetual motion machine, that is a system in which people are incentivized by their own self-interest to trade where you want them to trade, right? And if you set up the empire as a set of trade networks, then the royal administration can just kind of skim nickels off of the top of all this enormous trade that's going on. It's a very different concept than either, say, the Spanish or the Portuguese or the French or the Dutch had in their conceptions of empire in the early period. So the central kind of policy focus of the Navigation Acts that are passed primarily in the 1660s and the 1670s, in that decade or two after the Restoration, is to understand that there are a handful of commodities that are produced in the colonial world that can be brought back to Great Britain and turned around and sold for cash in the markets of Europe. That is, there are a handful of cash crops that are identified by the Navigation Acts and special rules imposed on them. And that's really the only focus of enforcement. Everything else is generated by those rules. By far the most valuable commodity produced in the New World by the end of the 17th century is sugar. Sugar outvalues virtually all other colonial commodities combined. Tobacco is important, and rice are important for the British North American colonies that eventually become the United States. But in the scope of the whole system, even those are relatively minor commodities compared to the value of sugar. So the Navigation Acts identified what are called the enumerated commodities, simply the numbered commodities, and you see that in the lower left-hand corner of the map on the screen: lumber, tobacco, rice, indigo, furs, and most important, sugar. And what the Navigation Acts require is that if you live in a British colony and you are producing any of those commodities, there is only one thing that you are permitted to do with that commodity. You got to put it in a barrel, put it on a boat, ship it back to Great Britain, and it has to be registered in a British port and the tax paid upon it. That ensures Charles a relatively, comparatively easy process of enforcing the rules. All he has to do is have a handful of customs inspectors and courts and judges to make sure that all of the colonial produce is being properly registered in the British ports, and the rest of the system runs of itself. It's essentially a laissez-faire system, because the most important thing then, if you're identifying these cash crops, and those are the things that you care about, is sustaining the plantations that produce those commodities. So if you live in a colony where those commodities are not produced, that is to say basically from Pennsylvania north, right, where lumber is produced in the New England woods, then very few of the rules of this system apply to you. In fact, you get to trade duty-free or tax-free to other British colonial ports, so your maximum profit is going to be to take your fish and your pork and your oats and your corn and your potatoes and sell them down to those Caribbean plantations, where so they can devote all of their slave labor to producing sugar and don't have to produce food crops for themselves. Now, there's very little legal enforcement to require you to do that if you're a Massachusetts, Boston merchant, right, collecting farm crops from Western Massachusetts. There's almost no police to require you to trade within the system, but the system is set up to incentivize you where that's where you're going to have the majority, your maximum profits, because you get to trade duty-free, and if you trade to virtually any other port, a Dutch port or a Spanish port or a Portuguese port, you're going to have to pay those taxes. Now, the key to making sure that the sugar plantation owners and the tobacco plantation owners and the rice and indigo plantation owners, that they do in fact send their crops to Great Britain to have the taxes paid, is to make sure that all of the kind of banking and insurance, capital and credit institutions of the empire reside in Great Britain. So there's a whole body of laws that prohibit colonists from having their own, what we would think of as kind of financial or market institutions. All of that has to remain in Great Britain. And for the most important of these, that is the sugar plantation owners, almost none of them actually live on their plantations. The sugar islands are horrible, awful places where 90% or more of the people there are slaves who are essentially being worked to death. It's not the place, if you're a rich Briton, if you're rich enough to own a sugar plantation, you would never want to live on it. Very different than Virginia or the Carolinas or Maryland. That is the British North American experience. It's one of the defining differences between colonial North American plantation owners and colonial Caribbean plantation owners. So if your banker and your insurance agent and the guy who's marketing your crops all live in Great Britain, you are locked into this institutional structure where you are going to send your tobacco and rice and indigo and sugar and whatnot to a British port because it has to be stamped there in order for you to get credit on British markets. Now, this system as it was originally created, this Navigation Act system, or this Acts of Trade system as it was originally designed in the 1660s and 1670s, was indeed sort of winked and nodded and ultimately approved when they voted on the Navigation Acts by Parliament to confer on the king these sources of revenue. So there's a constitutional ambiguity there, right? Did Parliament approve it? Well, sort of. What they did is they approved not having to give approval every time he collects one of these taxes or wants to impose a different kind of tax on his colonies. All of that is going to change in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution and the development of the Whig Constitution in the decade or so following 1688. And Parliament now, after 1688, is clearly dominant over especially the Hanover kings. The sign of that transition of authority is that the decisions over these acts of trade transfers to what's called the Board of Trade. And the more, again, in the 1680s and the 1690s into the early 18th century, increasingly regulations and memos and enforcement and whatnot around trade with the colonies, we see the Board of Trade making decisions rather than the King's ministers. And that's a mark of the dominance of the House of Commons or Parliament over the king in the aftermath of 1688. So we have this system that was created in the Restoration period to kind of carve out this preserve of monarchical authority, even with Parliament's permission, that after 1688 gets transferred under Parliament's power, but the way Parliament manages that is encapsulated in this famous phrase from the first English Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, who described Parliament's policy towards the colonies as one of salutary neglect, which is a famous phrase to describe the 18th century enforcement of the British trade system. By salutary neglect, what Walpole meant was exactly the logic that I just described. That is to say, it's essentially a laissez-faire system. We don't have to impose a lot of rules on the colonists to get them to keep the system going. All we really want is for the sugar and the tobacco and the rice to keep landing at British ports so that the government can collect its small tax on it. We're not that interested in a minute enforcement of every detail of the rules or creating a bunch of new rules. We're going to treat the colonists with salutary, that is benevolent, right? Looking out for their good, salutary neglect. By ignoring them, we're actually helping them pursue our objectives. So there's this strange kind of constitutional understanding tradition that it's well near a century in practice by the time we get to the American Revolution, in which there seems to be a consensus that in the British system, the colonies pretty much get left alone. Don't argue about whether you have to ship your sugar to us. That's non-negotiable. Beyond that, we have a kind of laissez-faire system where we're just collecting little chinks, little coins along the way of all the trade that you all are voluntarily engaged in. It's the change in that system, which comes about in the 1760s, that the colonists are going to rise up and revolt again. In order to understand that, we have to understand a little bit about the 7 Years' War. So let's turn to that next. As the phrase salutary neglect implies, the British system operated reasonably well through the first half of the 18th century. Certainly there were conflicts and disputes, but nothing that came close to blowing up the empire as a whole. But the British system did have this kind of inherent political weakness in it, which is to say that the vast majority of all the imperial taxes were paid by the owners of those plantations that produced those cash crops. Now, there may be a certain kind of fairness in that, you may think, but nevertheless, especially the owners of those sugar plantations, because they tended not to reside in the New World, but instead to be the nouveau riche of Great Britain. That is, they were some of the wealthiest men in the whole island, and new forms of wealth based on trade. They tended to form, or they developed into, a very powerful political constituency in British politics, and it was ultimately the complaints of those primarily sugar plantation owners which led Parliament to attempt to restructure the empire in the 1760s in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War. Now, the 7 Years' War you may have been introduced to in your high school history classes as the French and Indian War. You should think of the French and Indian War as the North American theater of a much broader global conflict, essentially global conflict. For our purposes, the causes of the 7 Years' War have to do with the rivalry between Great Britain and France for dominance in Europe. France was the great power of Europe, certainly from the middle of the 17th century through the middle of the 18th century, but Great Britain is rising as a military power, and they are coming increasingly into conflict in a series of short wars and kind of skirmishes all through the 1720s, 30s, and 40s, which blows up into this major European war, which has to do with the internal politics, primarily of Central and Eastern Europe, which was a war between Great Britain and Prussia on one side and France and Russia on the other. And the primary focus of the 7 Years' War was Central Northern Europe. Because the British knew they had a vastly superior navy and that the French were comparatively weak in their military presence in their colonies, Great Britain took advantage of that fact during the 7 Years' War to send military squadrons over to British North America and invade French territory. That campaign is largely treated in U.S. history textbooks as the French and Indian War. Now, the short version of the war is that Great Britain and Prussia win, France and Russia lose. Right? That's as much depth as we need to go into the war. But as a result of the peace negotiations and treaty that ends the war in 1761, Great Britain comes into possession of more than 90% of all the French possessions in the Western Hemisphere. The French managed to hang on to a handful of Caribbean islands, which are extremely valuable to them because they produce sugar, but are forced to concede virtually all of their remaining New World holdings to the British in order to obtain peace and to end the war. So the major outcome of the 7 Years' War from the British perspective is an enormous exponential increase in the amount of overseas territory that they are in control of. And you can see that in the two maps here in the lower left and the upper right that illustrate the British Empire in 1720 and then again the British Empire in 1763. You can see significant growth in their holdings, say, in the northern part of South America, in Latin America, on the west coast of Africa, and especially in the Indian subcontinent. So the British Empire is expanding and taking over those kind of what had been French enclaves in each of those areas. But by far the most dramatic outcome is in North America. If you'll see in all of those French, what we think of as Canadian possessions of the French around the Hudson Bay and the St. Lawrence Seaway are all conceded to Great Britain at the end of the war. Now, the war is tremendously expensive to Great Britain to build all these Navy ships and to arm and equip all of its soldiers and whatnot. And the political crisis at the end of the war within Great Britain over the war debt and who's going to pay for it is what brings to a climax the protests of those especially sugar plantation owners who recognize and argue we are not going to pay for 90+% of the cost of the war. We have to find a way to restructure the tax and kind of financial infrastructure of the empire and to redistribute the burden elsewhere. It's Parliament's response to those complaints that lead to the classic pieces of legislation that you're familiar with that produce the run-up to the American Revolution. So let's turn now and look at some of those pieces of legislation, and these are the same ones that John Dickinson is referring to, and try to understand Parliament's logic and its essential fairness from Parliament's perspective of what it's trying to do with the structure of the empire. So we'll turn to that now. Dickinson is writing his letters in the final months of 1767 through roughly the first half of 1768, and they are published as sort of letters to the editor or short essays on installment, first in the Philadelphia newspapers, and then they get reprinted in the other major colonial ports. Now, as he tells us in the first letter, he is prompted to begin writing by Parliament's decision to suspend the Colonial Assembly of New York. And they're doing so because the Colonial Assembly of New York refused to provide some certain provisions to the British troops in North America, which Parliament had ordered to be provided. Now, the New York Colonial Assembly takes this kind of rebellious or mutinous stance against Parliament about providing for the troops in protest against the Townshend Act or the Townshend Duties, which had been passed in the first part of 1767. So the immediate or the broader context, for Dickinson's letters are the Townshend Act of 1767. As we'll see in the next module, Thomas Paine is writing primarily in response to the battles of Lexington and Concord in the spring of 1775, though Common Sense won't be published as a pamphlet until early in 1776. It is conventional to kind of begin the narrative or timeline of imperial tyranny here in 1763 with the Proclamation of 1763, mostly because Jefferson identifies the Proclamation of 1763 as the first great crime of the king in his Declaration of Independence. Now, the Proclamation of 1763 simply created a boundary line that runs roughly down the center of the Blue Ridge Mountain, or the Appalachian Mountains, from New England all the way down to Georgia to the Gulf Coast. And what it promised, essentially, was it was a peace treaty that the king had negotiated with the Native American tribes, and a promise on behalf of the king that there would be no more white settlers taking up those Native Americans' lands. That was, by Jefferson's formulation in the Declaration of Independence, a gross violation of the natural rights of the colonists to take land from the state of nature and to claim it as their own property. The alteration in the trade laws that Dickinson is primarily focused on really begins in 1764 with the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act, the great irony of sort of declaiming the Sugar Act as an act of tyranny, is an act of Parliament that dramatically reduced the taxes on those enumerated commodities. Remember, sugar and tobacco and rice and indigo. Remember, the broad goal of Parliament is to shift the tax burden away from the producers of those cash crops. So the first step that they took was to dramatically reduce the taxes on the enumerated commodities. Now that, of course, was the great benefit, right? The payoff that Parliament was offering in exchange for increases in revenue in other places. And it's not a coincidence that the revolution started, the greatest colonial protest against these laws started precisely in those colonies that did not produce those cash crops. So if you lived in Pennsylvania North, you did not see any reduction in your taxes that would sort of compensate you for the burden you're about to take on with these other taxes that Parliament are going to impose. Now, Parliament has an initial scheme for how it's going to generate more revenue that will be more evenly distributed through all the colonies, and, if you will, not dependent upon what kinds of crops or commodities any given colony happened to focus on or produce. And so the foundational idea of the Stamp Act required a whole list of paper products in order to be legal to carry this little stamp, and you're going to have to pay a little, like a postage stamp. You'd have to pay to get the stamp, and then you'd have to put it on anything paper-based that you wanted to sell. So notoriously newspapers, in order to be a legal newspaper owner and to legally sell your newspapers, every copy of the newspaper you'd have to pay a pence or whatever it was to obtain a stamp, and you'd have to lick it and affix it to every single copy of your newspaper and distribute it. Now those kind of absurdist examples, though that would actually have been the law, or playing cards is another example that the colonists like to use, where they supposed every single card in a deck of cards would have to have the tax paid and had the little stamp put on it. Now, through a technical reading of the law, yes, that would be the most rigorous application. That's not primarily what Parliament was focused on. What they were focused on was legal documents. So if you go to court, and you just simply need to register a land title, your will and inheritance, all the normal kinds of documents, or if you're involved in a lawsuit and you have to have records made up by the courts to process your lawsuit, every legal document would absolutely be required to have one of these stamps affixed to it and a tax paid on it. So the broad notion is to move the tax burden from the crops and the commodities that are being transferred back and forth across the Atlantic, and instead to oppose the tax on every person who owns enough property to have to go interact with the court system to have official documents stamped. So if you're a very poor person, right, you're probably not going to court. If you don't own land, you're not going to court to get official documents stamped to prove that you own land. So the tax burden is conceived as somewhat equitable, right? It's going to fall on the upper portion of society, but it will fall whether you produce sugar or tobacco or indigo, or whether you produce fish and oats and potatoes and deer skin and the other commodities that these colonies produce. The imperial tax, would not be based on what kind of economic role your colony played. That was the kind of equitable Commonwealth vision of Parliament when it initially proposed the Stamp Act. But it was the Stamp Act that first led to violent kind of civil unrest in the major port cities and protests against the legislation. So this is when the Stamp Acts arrive, or the stamps arrive on ships from Britain. There are kind of thug vigilante groups that go out and seize them, just like about the Boston Tea Party. They did the same thing with the stamps. The colonists who had been appointed the Stamp Act collectors are terrorized and intimidated into either surrendering their posts, or if they refuse to, they are dragged out, tarred and feathered, and in other ways humiliated and driven out of town. It's the first violent resistance, open rebellion against imperial authority that's going to culminate in the revolution in 1776. The primary constitutional argument that colonists make in 1765 to denounce the Stamp Act is that this is a constitutional innovation because it is an internal tax. And we'll see Dickinson actually in the end dismiss this distinction between internal and external. But in 1765, the main James Otis, and there are others who write denunciations of this tax. And the essential argument is, and we're going to see this again in Dickinson, that the taxes imposed on the enumerated commodities, because they were collected in Britain, were external to the colonies. Right? They were collected in another place. This is the first time, this dirty Stamp Act is the first time ever in the history of the British Empire that Parliament has tried to come inside of the colonies, that is, within Virginia, within New York, within Pennsylvania, within Massachusetts, and collect its taxes there. Now, we'll see when we get into Dickinson's text whether or not this is a useful and substantial distinction, but it is the primary argument, the constitutional argument that colonists make in 1765. And Parliament responds, this is crucial, by conceding the point to the colonists and repealing the Stamp Act in 1766. Now, they also passed the Declaratory Act, which says, well, we could impose the Stamp Act if we wanted to, but we choose instead to repeal it, right? So they make a concession to the colonist complaint, and they try to design a new tax structure that respects what the colonists have insisted on as their constitutional right to be the sole authority over their own domestic taxation. So in 1767, Parliament passes the Townshend Act, or the Townshend Duties, and that refers to the Prime Minister, the Leader of Parliament at the time, Charles Townshend. What the Townshend Duties do is instead impose taxes on the producers of, in Great Britain, of those manufactured products. Dickinson refers to them as paper, glass, etc., but it includes all manner of things that the colonists can't produce themselves, including simple sort of metal forging things like hinges and latches and all manner of things that the colonists have no infrastructure to produce. Those products are primarily made in Great Britain, and what the Townshend Duties do is tax the manufacturers of those products, so they have to pay Parliament, and then they simply increase their prices when they sell those products to the colonists, so that the price increase includes the taxes that the manufacturer had to pay. From Parliament's perspective, they are respecting the constitutional arguments of the colonists, not trying to go collect the tax there within the colony, but instead collect it on the residents of Great Britain. The end effect, of course, is the same. The colonists are going to end up paying one way or the other, but this Parliament thinks honors that constitutional distinction between internal and external taxes. The primary lesson that we want to take from Dickinson, then, as we turn now to the text, is how difficult the time he's having constructing a constitutional argument about why Parliament should not have the power to collect taxes from little manufacturers who live in Great Britain. Why should the colonists be able to deny Parliament that authority, let alone prohibit Parliament from imposing laws within the colonies? And out of that struggle to articulate a coherent constitutional argument, Dickinson is going to return again and again to a handful of core principles. And we're going to see those core principles that Dickinson kind of stumbles his way into at the very foundation of the new constitutions that the Americans are going to write once they declare independence in 1776. So what we want to appreciate here as we turn now to the text is how difficult and murky and ambivalent a constitutional situation or environment that Dickinson finds himself in. And he's going to struggle again and again and again to explain the constitutional principles or identify the constitutional principles that would deny Parliament the right to act. So appreciating that about the historical context in which Dickinson is writing, let's turn now in the next segment and look at the first letter of the Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer.